On 20th November, we received orders to assume immediate command of the sector on both sides of Stalingrad as the headquarters of a newly created Don Army Group. I had just been on a trip to the front to visit VD Chevalery's Corps with my Chief of Operations, Colonel Boos, and had been delayed by the explosion of a mine under our train. In that territory, the presence of partisans made it necessary to travel in armoured vehicles or specially protected trains. Because the weather was too bad for flying, we had to leave Vitebsk by rail on 21st November and were once again held up by a mine attack. We reached HQ Army Group B, which was still responsible for our future sector, on 24th November, my 55th birthday. What we learnt here about the situation of 6th Army and the adjacent fronts of 4th Panzer Army and 3rd and 4th Romanian armies will be dealt with in the chapter on Stalingrad. My appointment as commander of Don Army Group brought me for the first time under Hitler's direct orders as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Wehrmacht, and the Army here. Only now did I find myself in a position to see how he tried to fulfill the duties of a supreme war leader besides those of a head of state, for hitherto I had felt his influence on military decisions at best indirectly and from afar. Because of the strict secrecy surrounding all matters of an operational nature, I had been unable to form any valid opinion of my own. During the campaign in Poland, we had been unaware of any interference by Hitler in the leadership of the army. On his 2 visits to Versa Rundstedt's army group, he had listened sympathetically to our interpretations of the situation and agreed to our intentions without making any attempt to intervene. As for the plan for the occupation of Norway, no outsider had known anything whatever about it. Hitler's attitude regarding the offensive in the West has already been discussed in detail. It was certainly both deplorable and alarming that he should have completely passed over OKH in this matter, yet it had to be conceded that his view that the solution must be an offensive one was fundamentally correct from the military point of view, even if the same could not be said of his original timing. Admittedly, he had laid down the outline of a plan which, as has already been pointed out, could hardly have produced a complete solution. At that stage, he had probably not thought it possible to attain results on the scale ultimately achieved. Nevertheless, when the plan put up by Army Group A offered him this possibility, he had immediately grasped the idea and adopted it himself, even though he imposed certain limitations which betrayed his aversion to risks. His fatal mistake of halting the armour outside Dunkirk had not at the time been apparent to an outsider, for the sight of beaches bestrewn with abandoned equipment tended to deceive anyone not yet aware how successful the British had been in getting their troops back across the Channel. The absence of a war plan permitting the timely preparation of an invasion did, however, reveal a failure of Wehrmacht leadership, in other words, on the part of Hitler himself. On the other hand, it was impossible for anyone not actually on the spot to judge whether or not the decision to turn on the Soviet Union was unavoidable for political reasons. The Soviet deployment on the German, Hungarian and Romanian frontiers certainly looked menacing enough. As commander of a corps, and later of 11th Army, I learnt just as little of Hitler's influence on the plan for an attack on the Soviet Union and the conduct of operations in the first phase of the campaign as I did of the plans for the summer offensive in 1942. There had certainly been no interference by Hitler in the handling of the Crimean campaign. Indeed, he had agreed to our intentions without hesitation when I went to see him in spring 1942, and had doubtless done everything to make our success at Sevastopol possible. I have already mentioned that I considered 11th Army to have been wrongly used after the fall of the fortress. Now that I had come immediately under Hitler in my capacity as an army group commander, however, I was to get my first real experience of him in his exercise of the supreme command. When considering Hitler in the role of a military leader, one should certainly not dismiss him with such clichés as the Lance Corporal of World War I. He undoubtedly had a certain eye for operational openings, as had been shown by the way he opted for Army Group A's plan in the West. Indeed, this is often to be found in military amateurs. Otherwise, history would not have recorded so many dukes and princes as successful commanders. In addition, though, Hitler possessed an astoundingly retentive memory and an imagination that made him quick to grasp all technical matters and problems of armaments. He was amazingly familiar with the effect of the very latest enemy weapons and could reel off whole columns of figures on both our own and the enemy's war production. Indeed, this was his favourite way of sidetracking any topic that was not to his liking. There can be no question that his insight and unusual energy were responsible for many achievements in the sphere of armaments. Yet his belief in his own superiority in this respect ultimately had disastrous consequences. His interference prevented the smooth and timely development of the Luftwaffe, and it was undoubtedly he who hampered the development of rocket propulsion and atomic weapons. Moreover, Hitler's interest in everything technical led him to overestimate the importance of his technical resources. As a result, he would count on a mere handful of assault gun detachments or the new Tiger tanks to restore situations where only large bodies of troops could have any prospect of success. What he lacked, broadly speaking, was simply military ability based on experience, something for which his intuition was no substitute. While Hitler may have had an eye for tactical opportunity and could quickly seize a chance when it was offered to him, he still lacked the ability to assess the prerequisites and practicability of a plan of operations. He failed to understand that the objectives and ultimate scope of an operation must be in direct proportion to the time and forces needed to carry it out, to say nothing of the possibilities of supply. He did not, or would not, realize that any long-range offensive operation calls for a steady build-up of troops over and above those committed in the original assault. All this was brought out with striking clarity in the planning and execution of the 1942 summer offensive. Another example was the fantastic idea he disclosed to me in autumn 1942 of driving through the Caucasus to the Near East and India with a motorized army group. As in the political sphere, at all events after his successes of 1938, so in the military did Hitler lack all sense of judgment regarding what could be achieved and what could not. In autumn 1939, despite his contempt for France's powers of resistance, he had not originally recognized the possibility of attaining decisive success by a correctly planned German offensive. Yet when this success actually became his, he lost his eye for opportunity where conditions were different. What he lacked in each case was a real training in strategy and grand tactics. And so this active mind seized on almost any aim that caught his fancy, causing him to fritter away Germany's strength by taking on several objectives simultaneously, often in the most dispersed theatres of war. The rule that one can never be too strong at the crucial spot, that one may even have to dispense with less vital fronts or accept the risk of radically weakening them in order to achieve a decisive aim, was something he never really grasped. As a result, in the offensives of 1942 and 1943, he could not bring himself to stake everything on success. Neither was he able or willing to see what action would be necessary to compensate for the unfavourable turn which events then took. As for Hitler's strategic aims, at least in the conflict with the Soviet Union, these were to a very great extent conditioned by political considerations and the needs of the German war economy. This has already been indicated in the introductory remarks on the Russian campaign and will emerge again in connection with the defensive battles of the years 1943-4. Now, questions of a political and economic nature are undoubtedly of great importance when it comes to fixing strategic aims. What Hitler overlooked was that the achievement and, most important of all, the retention of a territorial objective presupposes the defeat of the enemy's armed forces. So long as this military issue is undecided, and this may be seen from the struggle against the Soviet Union, the attainment of territorial aims in the form of economically valuable areas remains problematical, and their long-term retention a sheer impossibility. The day had yet to come when one could wreak such havoc on the enemy's armament centres or transport system with raiding aircraft or guided missiles that he was rendered incapable of continuing the fight. While strategy must unquestionably be an instrument in the hands of the political leadership, the latter must not disregard, as did Hitler to a great extent when fixing operational objectives, the fact that the strategic aim of any war is to smash the military defensive power of the enemy. Only when victory has been secured is the way open to the realization of political and economic aims. This brings me to the factor which probably did more than anything else to determine the character of Hitler's leadership, his overestimation of the power of the will. This will, as he saw it, had only to be translated into faith down to the youngest private soldier for the correctness of his decisions to be confirmed and the success of his orders ensured. Obviously, a strong will in a supreme commander is one of the essential prerequisites of victory. Many a battle has been lost, and many a success thrown away because the supreme leader's will failed at the critical moment. The will for victory which gives a commander the strength to see a grave crisis through is something very different from Hitler's will, which in the last analysis stemmed from a belief in his own mission. Such a belief inevitably makes a man impervious to reason and leads him to think that his own will can operate even beyond the limits of hard reality, whether these consist in the presence of far superior enemy forces, in the conditions of space and time, or merely in the fact that the enemy also happens to have a will of his own. Generally speaking, Hitler had little inclination to relate his own calculations to the probable intentions of the enemy, since he was convinced that his will would always triumph in the end. He was equally disinclined to accept any reports, however reliable, of enemy superiority, even though the latter might be many times stronger than he. Hitler either rejected such reports out of hand, or minimized them with assertions about the enemy's deficiencies, and took refuge in endless recitations of German production figures. In the face of his will, the essential elements of the appreciation of a situation on which every military commander's decision must be based were virtually eliminated. And with that, Hitler turned his back on reality. The only remarkable feature was that this overestimation of his own willpower, this disregard for the enemy's resources and possible intentions, was not matched by a corresponding boldness of decision. The same man who, after his successes in politics up to 1938, had become a political gambler, actually recoiled from risks in the military field. The only bold military decision that may be booked to Hitler's credit was probably the one he took to occupy Norway, and even then the original suggestion had come from Grand Admiral Raeder. Even here, as soon as a crisis cropped up at Narvik, Hitler was on the point of ordering the evacuation of the city and thereby of sacrificing the fundamental aim of the entire operation, which was to keep the iron ore routes open. During the execution of the Western Campaign, too, as we have seen earlier, Hitler showed a certain aversion to taking military risks. The decision to attack the Soviet Union was, in the last analysis, the inevitable outcome of cancelling the invasion of Britain, which Hitler had likewise found too risky. During the Russian campaign, Hitler's fear of risk manifested itself in two ways. One, as will be shown later, was his refusal to accept that elasticity of operations which, in the conditions obtaining from 1943 onwards, could be achieved only by a voluntary, if temporary, surrender of conquered territory. The second was his fear to denude secondary fronts or subsidiary theatres in favour of the spot where the main decision had to fall, even when a failure to do so was palpably dangerous. There are three possible reasons why Hitler evaded these risks in the military field. First, he may secretly have felt that he lacked the military ability to cope with them. This being so, he was even less likely to credit his generals with having it. The second reason was the fear, common to all dictators, that his prestige would be shaken by any setbacks. In practice, this attitude is bound to lead to the commission of military mistakes which damage the man's prestige more than ever. Thirdly, there was Hitler's intense dislike, rooted in his lust for power, of giving up anything on which he had once laid hands. In the same context, mention may be made of another trait of Hitler's, against which his Chief of Staff, Colonel General Zeitzler, and I both battled in vain throughout the period in which I was commanding Don Army Group. Whenever he was confronted with a decision which he did not like taking but could not ultimately evade, Hitler would procrastinate as long as he possibly could. This happened every time it was urgently necessary for us to commit forces to battle in time to forestall an operational success by the enemy or to prevent its exploitation. The General Staff had to struggle with Hitler for days on end before it could get forces released from less threatened sectors of the front to be sent to a crisis spot. In most cases, he would give too small a number of troops when it was already too late, with the result that he usually finished up by having to grant several times what had originally been required. The tussle used to last for whole weeks when it was a question of abandoning untenable positions like the Donetsk area in 1943 or the Dnieper Bend in 1944. The same applied to the evacuation of unimportant salients on quiet stretches of front for the purpose of acquiring extra forces. Possibly Hitler always expected things to go his way in the end, thereby enabling him to avoid decisions which were repugnant to him, if only because they meant recognizing the fact that he must accommodate himself to the enemy's actions. His inflated belief in his own willpower, a certain aversion to accepting any risk in mobile operations, the Retour offensive, for example, when its success could not be guaranteed in advance, and his dislike of giving up anything voluntarily, such were the factors which influenced Hitler's military leadership more and more as time went on. Obstinate defence of every foot of ground gradually became the be-all and end-all of that leadership. And so, after the Wehrmacht had won such extraordinary successes in the first years of war by dint of operational mobility, Hitler's reaction when the first crisis occurred in front of Moscow was to adopt Stalin's precept of hanging on doggedly to every single position. It was a policy that had brought the Soviet leaders so close to the abyss in 1941 that they finally relinquished it when the Germans launched their 1942 offensive. Yet because the Soviet counter-offensive in that winter of 1941 had been frustrated by the resistance of our troops, Hitler was convinced that his ban on any voluntary withdrawal had saved the Germans from the fate of Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. In this belief, admittedly, he was reinforced by the acquiescent attitude of his own retinue and several commanders at the front. When, therefore, a fresh crisis arose in autumn 1942 after the German offensive had become bogged down outside Stalingrad and in the Caucasus, Hitler again thought the arcanum of success lay in clinging at all costs to what he already possessed. Henceforth he could never be brought to renounce this notion. Now it is generally recognized that defense is the stronger of the two forms of fighting. This is only true, however, when the defense is so efficacious that the attacker bleeds to death when assaulting the defender's positions. Such a thing was out of the question on the Eastern Front, where the number of German divisions available was never sufficient for so strong a defence to be organised. The enemy, being many times stronger than we were, was always able, by massing his forces at points of his own choice, to break through fronts that were far too widely extended. As a result, large numbers of German forces were unable to avoid encirclement. Only in mobile operations could the superiority of the German staffs and fighting troops have been turned to account, and perhaps the forces of the Soviet Union ultimately brought to naught. The effects of Hitler's ever-increasing predilection for hanging on at all costs will be dealt with in greater detail in connection with the defensive battles fought on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944. The reason for his insistence on it may be found deep down in his own personality. He was a man who saw fighting only in terms of the utmost brutality. His way of thinking conformed more to a mental picture of masses of the enemy bleeding to death before our lines than to the conception of a subtle fencer who knows how to make an occasional step backwards in order to lunge for the decisive thrust. For the art of war he substituted a brute force which, as he saw it, was guaranteed maximum effectiveness by the willpower behind it. Since Hitler placed the power of force above that of the mind, and, while having every regard for a soldier's bravery, did not rate his ability to the same extent, it is hardly surprising that, in the same way as he overrated technical expedients, he was possessed of la rage du nombre. He would intoxicate himself with the production figures of the German armaments industry, which he had undoubtedly boosted to an amazing extent, even if he preferred to overlook the fact that the enemy's armaments figures were higher still. What he forgot was the amount of training and skill required to render a new weapon fully effective. Once the new weapons had reached the front, he was content. It did not worry him whether the units concerned had mastered them or not, or whether a weapon had even been tested under combat conditions. In just the same way, Hitler was constantly ordering new divisions to be set up. Though an increase in the number of our formations was most desirable, they had to be filled at the cost of replacements for the divisions already in existence, which in course of time were drained of their last drop of blood. At the same time, the newly established formations initially had to pay an excessively high toll of killed because of their lack of battle experience. The Luftwaffe field divisions, the unending series of SS divisions, and finally the so-called People's Grenadier divisions were the most blatant examples. A final point worth mentioning is that although Hitler was always harping on his soldierly outlook and loved to recall that he had acquired his military experience as a frontline soldier, his character had as little in common with the thoughts and emotions of soldiers as had his party with the Prussian virtues which it was so fond of invoking. Hitler was certainly quite clearly informed of conditions at the front through the reports he received from the army groups and armies. In addition, he frequently interviewed officers who had just returned from the front-line areas. Thus, he was not only aware of the achievements of our troops, but also knew what continuous overstrain they had had to endure since the beginning of the Russian campaign. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why we never managed to get Hitler anywhere near a front line in the east. It was hard enough to persuade him to visit our army group headquarters. The idea of going any further forward never occurred to him. It may be that he feared such trips would destroy those golden dreams about his invincible will. Despite the pains Hitler took to stress his own former status as a frontline soldier, I still never had the feeling that his heart belonged to the fighting troops. Losses, as far as he was concerned, were merely figures that reduced fighting power. They are unlikely to have seriously disturbed him as a human being. A former officer of OKW, who was transferred there after being badly wounded at the front, and whose job brought him into almost daily contact with Hitler, mainly at the daily briefings, but also at more private meetings, has written me the following note on this subject. I fully recognize the justification of this subjective feeling, i.e. that Hitler had no sympathy for the fighting troops and regarded losses as mere figures. That was how he appeared among a large body of people, but in reality he was almost the opposite. From a soldier's point of view, he was possibly even too soft and certainly too dependent on his emotions. It was symptomatic that he could not stand any encounter with the horrors of war. He was afraid of his own softness and susceptibility, which would have hampered him in making the decisions that his political will demanded of him. Casualties which he was compelled to deal with personally, or of which he was given realistic descriptions, were a source of horror to him, and obviously caused him as much suffering as the deaths of people he knew. On the strength of several years' observation, I do not believe that this was play acting, but simply one side of his character. Outwardly, therefore, he assumed a deliberate air of indifference to avoid being distracted by the trait of which he himself was afraid. This is also the more deep-seated reason why he did not go to the front or visit any of the bombed cities. It was quite certainly not due to any lack of personal courage, but to the fear of being horrified by what he would see. At private gatherings, it was often noted in conversations about the efforts and achievements of the fighting troops that he had a great appreciation and sympathy for them. The opinion of this officer, who was not one of Hitler's supporters or admirers, at least shows what dissimilar impressions people could have of Hitler's character and mentality, and how difficult it really was to get to the bottom of them. If, as is maintained above, Hitler actually was soft-hearted, how can one explain the brutal cruelty which became increasingly typical of his regime as time went on? Author. In one respect, however, Hitler's outlook was entirely soldier-like in the matter of war decorations. With these, his first and foremost aim was to honour the brave among the fighting men, and the regulations he issued regarding the award of the Iron Cross at the beginning of the campaign were a model of their kind. This decoration, he decided, should be conferred only for deeds of bravery and outstanding leadership, which meant that, as far as the latter category was concerned, it could be won only by formation commanders and their senior staff officers. Unfortunately, many of those responsible for awarding the decoration failed all along to observe this lucid and admirable ruling, partly, it must be admitted, as a result of the delay in creating a cross for meritorious war service, the Kriegsverdienstkreuz, which was intended for those who, though employed on duties rendering them ineligible for the Iron Cross, still deserved distinction. With Hitler, it was always harder to secure a Knight's Cross for a deserving general than for an officer or man at the front. As for the retrospective tendency to deride the many different badges and insignia that Hitler created in the course of the war, people should merely bear in mind what feats our soldiers accomplished during the many long years of its duration. Badges like the Close Combat Clasp, the Nahkampfspange, and the 11th Army Crimean Shield were at all events worn with pride. Besides, the number of medal ribbons worn by soldiers on the other side shows that the question of war decorations is not to be dismissed with a lot of silly talk about tin gongs. The deficiencies I have just described were bound to detract considerably from Hitler's fitness to play the self-appointed role of the supreme military leader. They could still have been counterbalanced, however, if only he had been prepared to take advice from, and place genuine confidence in, an experienced and jointly responsible Chief of the General Staff. He did, after all, possess a number of the qualities indispensable to a supreme commander: a strong will, nerves that would stand up to the most serious crises, an undeniably keen brain and, as I said before, a certain talent in the operational field combined with an ability to recognize possibilities of a technical nature. If only he could have seen his way to compensate for his lack of training and experience in the military sphere, particularly as regards strategy and grand tactics, by utilizing the skill of his chief of staff, quite an efficient military leadership might have emerged despite all the shortcomings mentioned above. But this was precisely what Hitler would not accept. Just as he considered the power of his will to be in every way decisive, so had his political successes, and indeed the military victories early in the war, which he regarded as his own personal achievement, caused him to lose all sense of proportion in assessing his own capabilities. To him, the acceptance of advice from a jointly responsible chief of staff would not have meant supplementing his own will, but submitting it to that of another. Added to this was the fact that he was imbued by origin and background with an insuperable mistrust of the military leaders, whose code and way of thinking were alien to him. Thus he was not prepared to see a really responsible military adviser alongside himself. He wanted to be another Napoleon, who had only tolerated men under him who would obediently carry out his will. Unfortunately, he had neither Napoleon's military training nor his military genius. I have already shown in the chapter dealing with the plan for the invasion of Britain that Hitler had so organized the Supreme Command that no one was vested with the authority to advise him on grand strategy or to draft a war plan. The operations staff, Wehrmachtführungsstab of OKW, which was theoretically qualified to discharge such a task, in practice merely played the role of a military secretariat. Its only raison d'être was to translate Hitler's ideas and instructions into the terminology of military orders. But there was even worse to come. Hitler's designation of Norway as an OKW theatre of operations, in which OKH had no authority, was only the first step in the disruption of land operations. In due course, all the other theatres were gradually turned over to OKW. Finally, only the eastern one remained as an OKH responsibility, and even then it had Hitler at its head. Hence, the Chief of Staff of the army was left with just as little influence on the other theatres of war as were the commanders-in-chief of the two other services in matters of grand strategy. He had no say whatever in the overall distribution of the army's forces, and often did not even know for certain what troops and material were being sent to the various theatres. In the circumstances, it was inevitable that the OKW operations staff and the general staff of the army should clash. Indeed, Hitler probably created clashes deliberately in order that he alone should at all times have the decisive say. Naturally, such faulty organization of the supreme military leadership was bound to contribute decisively to its breakdown. Another consequence of Hitler's overestimation of his willpower and military ability was that he attempted more and more to interfere by separate orders of his own in the running of subordinate formations. It has always been the special forte of German military leadership that it relies on commanders at all levels to show initiative and willingness to accept responsibility, and does everything in its power to promote such qualities. That is why, as a matter of principle, the directives of higher commands and the orders of medium and lower commands always contained so-called assignments for subordinate formations. The detailed execution of these assignments was the business of the subordinate commanders concerned. This system of handling orders was largely the reason for the successes scored by the German army over its opponents, whose own orders generally governed the actions of subordinate commanders down to the very last detail. Only when there was no other possible alternative left did anyone on our side encroach upon the authority of a subordinate formation headquarters by specifically laying down the action it should take. Hitler, on the other hand, thought he could see things much better from behind his desk than the commanders at the front. He ignored the fact that much of what was marked on his far too detailed situation maps was obviously out of date. From that distance, moreover, he could not possibly judge what was the proper and necessary action to take on the spot. He had grown increasingly accustomed to interfering in the running of the army groups, armies, and lower formations by issuing special orders, which were not his concern at all. While I had hitherto been spared such interference in my own sphere of command, I was forewarned of it by what Field Marshal Versus Klug had to tell me when I met him on a railway station on my way from Vitebsk to Rostov. At Central Army Group, he said, he had to consult Hitler before any operation involving forces of a battalion or more could be mounted. Even if I personally did not experience such intolerable interference later on, there were still to be quite enough clashes with the Supreme Command as a result of Hitler's meddling. In contrast to his passion for individual orders, which were usually nothing but a hindrance to command staffs and detrimental to operations, Hitler was loath to issue long-term operational directives. The more he came to regard the principle of holding on at all costs as the alpha and omega of his policy, the less prepared was he to issue long-term directives which took account of the normally foreseeable development of a strategic situation. That such methods must ultimately have placed him at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the enemy was something he refused to see. His mistrust of his subordinate commanders prevented him from giving them, in the form of long-term directives, freedom of action, which they might put to a use that was not to his liking. The effect of this, however, was to do away with the very essence of leadership. In the long run, even an army group could not get along without directives from the Supreme Command, certainly not when it formed part of a larger front and was bound to its neighbours on either flank. We often thought nostalgically of our days in the Crimea, when we had been able to fight in a theatre all of our own. It still remains for me to show, in as far as I can do so from personal experience, what pattern the disputes took which inevitably arose between Hitler and the army leaders as a result of his attitude to questions of military leadership. Many of the accounts on record depict him as foaming at the mouth and even taking an occasional bite at the carpet. Although he did undoubtedly lose all self-control on occasions, the only time he ever raised his voice or behaved badly when I was present was during the episode with Halder, which I have already mentioned. Hitler obviously sensed just how far he could afford to go with his interlocutor and what people he could hope to intimidate with outbursts of rage that may often have been simulated. I must say that as far as my own personal contacts with him went, he maintained appearances and kept things on a factual plane even when our views collided. On the one occasion when he did become personal, the extremely sharp retort it evoked was accepted in silence. Hitler had a masterly knack of psychologically adapting himself to the individual whom he wished to bring round to his point of view. In addition, of course, he always knew anyone's motive for coming to see him, and could thus have all his counter-arguments ready beforehand. His faculty for inspiring others with his own confidence, whether feigned or genuine, was quite remarkable. This particularly applied when officers who did not know him well came to see him from the front. In such cases, a man who had set out to tell Hitler the truth about things out there came back converted and bursting with confidence. In the various disputes I had with Hitler on operational matters in my capacity as an army group commander, what impressed me most was the incredible tenacity with which he would defend his point of view. There was almost invariably a tussle of several hours' duration before his visitor either attained his object or retired empty-handed, at best consoled with empty promises. I have known no other man who could show anything like the same staying power in a discussion of this kind. And while the maximum time involved in any dispute with a front-line commander would at worst be several hours, the Chief of Staff, General Zeitzler, often had to battle for days on end at the evening conferences in order to get Hitler to take the necessary action. Whenever one of these contests was in progress, we always used to ask Zeitzler what round they had reached. Besides, the arguments with which Hitler defended his point of view, and I include the purely military ones here, were not usually of a kind that could be dismissed out of hand. After all, in any discussion of operational intentions, one is almost always dealing with a matter whose outcome nobody can predict with absolute certainty. Nothing is certain in war when all is said and done. Whenever Hitler perceived that he was not making any impression with his opinions on strategy, he immediately produced something from the political or economic sphere. Since he had a knowledge of the political and economic situations with which no frontline commander could compete, his arguments here were generally irrefutable. As a last resort, all one could do was to insist that if he did not agree to the proposals or demands submitted to him, things would go wrong militarily and in turn have even worse repercussions in the political and economic fields. On the other hand, Hitler frequently showed himself to be a very good listener even when he did not like what was being asked of him, and on such occasions he was quite capable of objective discussion. Naturally, no relationship of any intimacy could develop between this fanatical dictator, who thought only of his political aspirations and lived in a belief in his mission, and the military leaders. The personal element obviously did not interest Hitler in the least. To him, human beings were merely tools in the service of his political ambitions. From his own side, there sprang no bond of loyalty to the German soldier. The ever more apparent defects in Germany's military leadership, some of which arose from Hitler's character and others from the quite impossible organization of the Supreme Command outlined earlier on, naturally raised the question of whether anything could be done to bring about a change. I prefer to leave the political aspects aside here, as indeed I have done everywhere else in this book. I made no less than 3 attempts, in the interest of a more rational conduct of the war, to persuade Hitler to accept some modification of the Supreme Command. From no other quarter, as far as I know, was the inadequacy of his military leadership ever put to him quite so bluntly. I was fully alive to the fact that Hitler would never be prepared to relinquish the Supreme Command officially. As a dictator, he could not possibly have done so without suffering what for him would have been an intolerable loss of prestige. In my opinion, everything depended, therefore, on persuading Hitler, while nominally retaining the position of Supreme Commander, to leave the conduct of military operations in all theatres of war to one responsible Chief of Staff and to appoint a special Commander-in-Chief for the Eastern Theatre. These attempts of mine, which unfortunately proved unavailing, will be discussed further when I come to deal with the events of the years 1943–4. For me, they were a particularly precarious undertaking, for Hitler knew full well that I was the very man many people in the army would like to see in the position of a proper Chief of Staff, or as Commander-in-Chief in the East. It is not my intention here to go into the question of changing the leadership of the Reich by violent means, as exemplified by the events of 20th of July 1944, although I may do so one day. Within the scope of these war memoirs, it is enough to say that as one responsible for an army group in the field, I did not feel I had the right to contemplate a coup d'état in wartime, because in my own view it would have led to an immediate collapse of the front and probably to chaos inside Germany. Apart from this, there was always the question of the military oath and the admissibility of murder for political motives. As I said at my trial, no senior military commander can for years on end expect his soldiers to lay down their lives for victory and then precipitate defeat by his own hand. In any case, it was already clear by that time that not even a coup d'état would make any difference to the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. At the time when I held a command, we had not, to my mind, reached the point where such action had to be regarded as the only possible solution. Stranger, to Sparta say, her faithful band, here lie in death, remembering her command. Never will these lines, telling of the heroism of the defenders of Thermopylae and ever after regarded as the song of praise to bravery, fidelity, and soldierly obedience, be carved in stone at Stalingrad in memory of Sixth Army's martyrdom on the Volga. Nor is any cross or cenotaph likely to be raised over the vanished traces of the German soldiers who starved, froze, and died there. Yet the memory of their indescribable suffering, their unparalleled heroism, fidelity, and devotion to duty will live on long after the victors' cries of triumph have died away, and the bereaved, the disillusioned, and the bitter at heart have fallen silent. The Battle of Stalingrad is understandably treated by the Soviets as the turning point of the war. The British ascribe similar importance to the Battle of Britain. The Americans are inclined to attribute the Allies' final success to their own entry into hostilities. In Germany, too, many people feel constrained to regard Stalingrad as the decisive battle of World War II. In point of fact, not one of these individual events should really be rated as decisive. The outcome of the war was decided by a wealth of factors, the most significant of which was probably the hopelessly inferior position in which Germany ultimately found herself vis-à-vis her opponents in consequence of Hitler's policies and strategy. Stalingrad was certainly a turning point to the extent that the wave of German offensives broke on the Volga, to recede like a breaker on the ebbing tide. But grave though the loss of Sixth Army undoubtedly was, it still need not have meant that the war in the East, and ipso facto the war as a whole, was irretrievably lost. It would still have been conceivable to force a stalemate if Germany's policies and military leadership had been adapted to such a solution. The cause of Sixth Army's destruction at Stalingrad is obviously to be found in Hitler's refusal, doubtless mainly for reasons of prestige, to give up the city voluntarily. Yet the fact that Sixth Army could ever land in such a situation at all was due to the operational errors committed beforehand by the Supreme Command in the planning and execution of the 1942 offensive, most of all with regard to its final stages. The plight in which the German southern wing found itself in the late autumn of 1942 as a result of these mistakes will be dealt with in the chapter on the winter campaign of 1942-3. All I propose to do here is to bring out the points which settled the fate of Sixth Army. Thanks to the fact that Hitler's strategic objectives were governed chiefly by the needs of his war economy, the German offensive of 1942 had split into two different directions, the Caucasus and Stalingrad. By the time the German advance came to a halt, therefore, a front had emerged to hold which there were not enough German forces available. To make things worse, no strategic reserve existed, the Supreme Command having squandered 11th Army in every conceivable direction. Immediately it became free in the Crimea. Army Group A, with its front facing south, was located in the north of the Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian. Army Group B held a front facing east and northeast, which began on the Volga south of Stalingrad and bent back north of the city to join the Middle Don, along which it continued to a point north of Voronezh. Neither of the two army groups was strong enough to hold fronts of this length, particularly if one bore in mind that despite its heavy losses, the enemy's southern wing had been able to avoid destruction and was not really beaten at all. Apart from this, the enemy had very strong strategic reserves in his other sectors, as well as in the hinterland. Last but not least, a gap 190 miles wide yawned between the two army groups in the Kalmyk steppes, guarded only by the quite inadequate resources of one division, 16 motorized, based on Yelista. The attempt to hold this overextended front for any length of time constituted the first of the mistakes which were to plunge Sixth Army into its desperate situation at the end of November 1942. The second and even more fatal mistake was that Hitler compelled Army Group B to tie down its principal striking force, 4th Panzer and 6th Armies, in the fighting in and around Stalingrad. The job of protecting the deep northern flank of this group along the Don was left to 3rd Romanian Army, one Italian and one Hungarian army, and, in the Voronezh sector, to the weak 2nd German Army. Hitler must have known that even behind the Don the Allied armies could not stand up to a strong Soviet attack. The same was true of 4th Romanian Army, which he had entrusted with the task of guarding the open right flank of 4th Panzer Army. The attempt to gain control of the Volga by taking Stalingrad in a set battle after the original assault had been only partially successful, would at best have been admissible on a very short-term basis. But to leave the main body of the army group at Stalingrad for weeks on end with inadequately protected flanks was a cardinal error. It amounted to nothing less than presenting the enemy with the initiative we ourselves had resigned on the whole southern wing, and was a clear invitation to him to surround Sixth Army. A third mistake was the utterly grotesque chain of command on the German southern wing. Army Group A had no commander of its own whatever. It was commanded by Hitler in what might be called a part-time capacity. Army Group B had no fewer than 7 armies under command, including 4 Allied ones. No army group headquarters can cope with more than 5 armies at the outside, and when most of these are Allied ones, the task inevitably becomes too much for it. HQ Army Group B had quite rightly established itself at Starobielsk, behind the defensive front on the Don, in order to keep a better eye on the Allied armies. The choice of this location, however, also meant that the headquarters was much too distant from the right wing of its sector. Another factor was that by his frequent interference in the conduct of operations, Hitler largely deprived the Army Group headquarters of control of 6th Army. It is true that OKH had recognized these command problems and made plans to create a new Don Army Group under Marshal Antonescu. The new headquarters had not been set up, however, as Hitler first wished to see Stalingrad fall. This failure to use the Romanian marshal was a serious mistake. Admittedly, his capacity for command was untried so far, but he was certainly a good soldier. In any case, his presence would have lent greater weight to our calls for further forces to guard the flanks of the Stalingrad front. He was, after all, a head of state and an ally to whom Hitler had to pay greater heed than to German army group and army commanders. Above all, Antonescu's personality would have served to brace up the senior Romanian commanders, who respected this man no less than they did the Russians. It was clear from an impassioned letter he wrote me after my assumption of command that the Marshal had on several occasions called attention to the dangers of the situation in general and that of 3rd Romanian Army in particular. As long as he did not hold a responsible command at the front, however, these comments of his inevitably lacked the emphasis they would have carried if uttered by a head of state simultaneously answerable for the sector that was threatened. It was equally clear that neither Army Group B nor 6th Army had failed to give warning of the big offensive the enemy was preparing to launch against the covering fronts on each side of Stalingrad. Finally, mention should be made of a fact which had grave repercussions on the position of 6th Army and the entire southern wing. The whole of Army Group A, as well as 4th Panzer and 6th Armies, 3rd and 4th Romanian Armies and the Italian Army, were based on a single Dnieper crossing, the railway bridge at Dnipropetrovsk. The repair of the Zaporozhye railway bridge and the link across the Ukraine through Nikolaev and Kherson to the Crimea and thence across the Straits of Kerch had either been discontinued or was not yet complete. The north-to-south link behind the German lines was equally unsatisfactory. When it came to bringing up fresh troops or quickly switching forces behind the front, Therefore, the German Supreme Command found itself at a permanent disadvantage vis-à-vis the enemy, who had much more efficient communications at his disposal in every direction. Every commander-in-chief must run risks if he wants to succeed. The risk undertaken by the Supreme Command in the late autumn of 1942, however, should never have consisted in tying down the most hard-hitting forces of Army Group B at Stalingrad over a long period in which it was content to leave the Don front covered by such an easily destructible screen. One possible argument in the Supreme Command's favour is that it was quite unprepared for the Allied armies to break down so completely. Yet the Romanians, who were still the best of our allies, fought exactly as our experiences in the Crimea implied they would. Any illusions about the Italians' fighting capacities, of course, were inexcusable from the start. The risk which the German command ought to have taken, after the summer offensive had merely won us more territory without bringing about the decisive defeat of the Soviet southern wing, consisted in returning to mobile operations between the Caucasus and middle reaches of the Don, with due advantage being taken of the large bend of the river, in order to prevent the enemy from attaining the initiative. But to substitute one risk for another was not in keeping with Hitler's mentality. By failing to take appropriate action after his offensive had petered out without achieving anything definite, he paved the way to the tragedy of Stalingrad. The OKH order received by 11th Army Headquarters on 21st November in the Vitebsk area laid down that for the purpose of stricter coordination of the armies involved in the arduous defensive battles to the west and south of Stalingrad, we were to take over command of 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army and 3rd Romanian Army as HQ Don Army Group. Since we lacked a Quartermaster General's branch, we were to be joined by the one already formed for Marshal Antonescu. It was headed by Colonel Fink, a General Staff officer whose soundness of character was matched only by his extraordinary talent for organising supply and transport, and who in due course mastered all the supply difficulties with which the Army Group constantly found itself confronted. The airlift to 6th Army, unfortunately, was outside his control. After my recall in April 1944, Colonel Fink was transferred to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief in the West, where, I am told, he soon had supply and transport in a state as near perfection as the enemy's complete domination of the skies permitted. As one of the men implicated in the conspiracy against Hitler, he was executed after 20th of July 1944. Don Army Group's task, as defined in the OKH order, was to bring the enemy attacks to a standstill and recapture the positions previously occupied by US. Initially, the only reinforcements promised us were a corps headquarters and a division which were to be moved up to Milerovo, behind the future right wing of Army Group B. It may be gathered from the wording of our task and the insignificance of the proposed reinforcements that when issuing this order, OKH still did not realize the danger of the situation around Stalingrad, although the ring had closed around 6th Army that very day. Further information was forthcoming in Vitebsk and during a train stop when I was able to talk to Field Marshal versus Kluge and his Chief of Staff, General Wöhler. From this I gathered that the enemy had broken through 3rd Romanian Army's front on the Don northwest of Stalingrad in very great strength. Between 1 and 2 Soviet tank armies were involved, in addition to a great deal of cavalry, in all some 30 formations. The same thing had happened south of Stalingrad to 4th Romanian Army, which was under command of 4th Panzer Army. Before leaving Vitebsk, therefore, I sent the Chief of the General Staff a teleprinter message pointing out that in view of the magnitude of the enemy effort, our task at Stalingrad could not be merely a matter of regaining a fortified stretch of front. What we should need to restore the situation would be forces amounting to an army in strength, none of which, if possible, should be used for a counter-offensive until their assembly was fully complete. General Zeitzler agreed with me and promised to try to let us have an armoured division and 2 or 3 infantry divisions by way of addition. I also teleprinted a request to Army Group B that 6th Army be instructed to withdraw forces quite ruthlessly from its defence fronts in order to keep its rear free at the Don crossing at Kalach. Whether this instruction was ever passed to 6th Army, I have been unable to discover. Not until we arrived at HQ Army Group B in Starobielsk on 24th of November did we obtain a clear picture of recent events and the current situation from the commander, Colonel General Baron versus Wykes, and his Chief of Staff, General Vesus Sodenstern. In the early hours of 19th November, after a tremendous artillery barrage, the enemy had broken out of his Don bridgehead at Kremenskaya and had also crossed the river further west to attack both the left wing of 6th Army, 11 Corps, and 3rd Romanian Army, 4 and 5 Romanian Corps. Simultaneously, he had launched a strong attack against 4th Panzer Army, Colonel General Hoth, south of Stalingrad, where it was intermingled with 4th Romanian Army. While the left wing of 6th Army had held firm, the enemy had been able to overrun the Romanians completely on both fronts. At each of the 2 points of penetration, strong Soviet tank forces had immediately pushed through in depth, just as we had taught them to do. By an early hour on 21st of November, they had already linked up on the Don at Kalach, where the bridge so vital for the supply of 6th Army had fallen into their hands intact. Since the forenoon of that day, therefore, the ring had been closed around 6th Army and the German and Romanian elements of 4th Panzer Army, which had been squeezed back into the pocket from the area south of Stalingrad. The encircled troops included 5 German corps, totaling 20 divisions, 2 Romanian corps, the mass of the army artillery not on the Leningrad front, and large numbers of army engineer units. Even later on, the army group was unable to obtain any exact data on the sum total of German soldiers trapped in the pocket. The returns sent in by 6th Army fluctuated between 200,000 and 270,000 men. But it must be remembered here that the stated ration strengths included not only the Romanian troops, but also many thousand indigenous volunteers, the so-called Hiwis, and prisoners of war. The most commonly quoted figure of over 300,000 is undoubtedly exaggerated. Various communication zone troops were left outside the pocket, as were part of the B echelon transport, a number of the wounded, and all ranks on leave. These residual elements, which later formed the cadres with which most of the 6th Army divisions were reconstituted, still amounted to anything between 1,500 and 3,000 men per division. If one bears in mind that the divisions of 6th Army had already fallen off in strength in November, the estimate that there were 200,000, 220,000 men in the pocket, even allowing for the strong complement of army artillery and engineers, is probably fairly accurate. The situation on 24th November was approximately as follows. The only intact formations left to 4th Panzer Army were 16 motorized division on its southern wing, widely extended across the steppes on both sides of Yelista, and 18 Romanian division on the northern side. All the other Romanians had either been thrown back into Stalingrad or overrun. With what remnants of the Romanian units it could scrape together, plus various German communications zone troops, the army tried to hold an emergency defence line forward of Kotelnikovo and was not attacked again for the time being. What was left of 4th Romanian Army, including the headquarters, was placed under command of Colonel General Hoth. After the Romanian collapse, his 4 corps, which had been part of the front south of Stalingrad, had swung back onto a front south and southwest of Stalingrad and had come under command of 6th Army. 6th Army, consisting of 4, 8, 11 and 51 Army Corps and 14 Panzer Corps, was surrounded at Stalingrad. It had taken 11 corps and elements of 8 corps out of the front facing north on both sides of the Don and put them into the pocket's newly formed western front, the salient tip of which reached to a point east of the Kalach Bridge. A new southern front had been formed out of reserves and those elements of 4th Panzer, or 4th Romanian Army, which had been thrown back to Stalingrad. The pocket measured about 30 miles across from east to west, and 25 miles from north to south. Both wings of 3rd Romanian Army had been broken through. In its centre, a group of about 3 divisions under the same General Laskar, who had distinguished himself at Sevastopol, had put up a brave resistance, but they had since been surrounded and were now thought to have been captured. 48. Panzer Corps, which had been in reserve behind the front facing the Don bridgehead, had launched what appears to have been a belated counterattack, but this had proved unsuccessful. Both its divisions were now encircled and under orders to fight their way out to the west. The Corps commander, General Heim, had already been replaced on orders from Hitler and summoned to the latter's headquarters. There Hitler had him sentenced to death at a court-martial presided over by Goering, who was always available for tasks of this kind, on the ground that he, General Heim, was to blame for his corps' failure. Heim was later rehabilitated when it was found that his forces had indeed been too weak for the task confronting them. 48. Corps consisted of the newly formed Romanian Armoured Division, which had had no battle experience whatever, and 22 Panzer Division, which had obviously not been up to standard from a technical point of view. For all practical purposes, 3rd Romanian Army had only about 3 divisions still in existence. They were those of 1 and 2 Romanian Corps, which had not been drawn into the battle and were located next to the Italians on the Don. In the opinion of Army Group B, 6th Army had at most 2 days' ammunition and 6 days' rations left. These estimates were subsequently found to have been too low. The airlift to date, insofar as the weather had permitted one to operate at all, had provided only 1/10 of the Army's requirements of ammunition and fuel. 100 Junkers aircraft, equivalent to a working load of 200 tons less the inevitable losses, had been promised, and others were to follow. Intelligence reports showed that the enemy had poured some 24 formations, i.e. divisions and armoured or mechanized brigades, through the gap he had torn in the front south of Stalingrad. These had then wheeled north against the southern flank of 6th Army, which they were fiercely attacking. From the point where he had penetrated 3rd Romanian Army, the enemy had also pushed about 24 formations through towards Kallach in the rear of 6th Army. About 23 more had been reported further west, advancing south and southwest towards the Chir. In addition, there were the Soviet troops in Stalingrad, who had held out all along against 6th Army's attacks and were now being reinforced across the Volga, as well as the superior forces still opposite the northern front of 6th Army between the Volga and Don. Finally, there was no doubt that the enemy was continuously bringing up reinforcements by rail. Even by 28th November, a total of 143 major formations, i.e. divisions, armoured brigades, etc., had been identified in the operations area of the new Don Army Group. The forces to form Don Army Group under my command were as follows. First, there was 6th Army, surrounded at Stalingrad by an enemy roughly 3 times as strong, and composed of 20 very tired German and 2 Romanian divisions. Its stocks of ammunition, fuel and food were running low, and there was no steady inflow of supplies to build them up again. Quite apart from the fact that it was surrounded, the army enjoyed no operational freedom whatever, having received categorical orders from Hitler to hold fast to the fortress of Stalingrad. Next came the remnants of 4th Panzer Army and the 2 Romanian armies. The best forces we possessed at present were one hitherto untouched German division, 16 motorized, which could not be withdrawn from its defensive positions out in the steppes because it constituted Army Group A's only cover from the rear, and 4 still intact Romanian divisions, whose combat value was unquestionably inferior to that of the Russians. 6th Army's subordination to HQ Don Army Group was more or less a fiction. However, in practice, it had hitherto come directly under OKH. It was Hitler who had tied it down at Stalingrad, when it might still have been able to fight its own way out. Now, operationally speaking, it was immobilized. The army group could no longer command it, but merely give it assistance. Besides, Hitler was still maintaining his direct control of 6th Army by a General Staff liaison officer who was installed with his own signals section at 6th Army headquarters. Even in the matter of supplies, Hitler had the final say, since he alone had the means at his disposal to maintain the army from the air. Strictly speaking, therefore, I should have been right to decline to have 6th Army in my army group, and to insist that it formally remain under the direct orders of OKH. I did not do so at the time, because I hoped that I should be in a better position than OKH to ensure the direct cooperation of the relieving forces with the encircled army. Why this cooperation did not materialize in the decisive phase will be shown later. Apart from 6th Army, which being surrounded was unusable in the operational sense, all that Don Army Group found awaiting it initially were mere remnants. It was envisaged that the Army Group should receive the following new forces, to be allocated as below. Forces from Tyrol. HQ 57 Corps, 23 Panzer Division, Strong Army Artillery Army Group, a 4th PES, Army Relief Drive on Stalingrad from south. 6 Panzer Division, recently brought up to strength, West 1 Corps HQ, 4-5 Divisions, 3rd Romanian Army, left wing, to relieve Stalingrad by advance eastwards from Upper Cheer as Army Detachment Hollit. At HQ Army Group B, I was shown a message which General Paulus, the commander of 6th Army, had radioed to Hitler on, to the best of my recollection, 22nd or 23rd November. It stated that he and all his corps commanders considered it absolutely imperative that the army should break out to the southwest. To raise the forces needed for such an operation, however, he would have to shift certain formations around inside the army, and for the purpose of economizing in troops, take his northern front back onto a shorter line. The view taken at Army Group headquarters was that even if Hitler had given immediate approval, no breakout could have started before 28th November. However, Hitler had turned the request down and forbidden any retraction of the northern front. To make his point quite clear, he had entrusted General Versailles with command of the whole front in question. The staff of Don Army Group had neither the time nor the opportunity to retrace past events in 6th Army. Evidently, General Paulus did everything possible, within the limits of Hitler's order binding him to Stalingrad, to extract forces from those of his army fronts which were not so seriously threatened in the first instance. By pulling in 4 corps of 4th Panzer Army, he was able to assemble a new front on his open south flank. Furthermore, he tried to keep his rear free by throwing 14 Panzer Corps from the eastern to the western bank of the Don. Unfortunately, it ran into superior Soviet forces west of the river. At the very same time, 11 Corps, which was still holding its position west of the Don with a front facing north, was attacked in the rear. This situation led 6th Army to pull both corps back into a bridgehead west of the Don and subsequently across the river to the east, so that it could form an all-round front between the Don and Volga. Although these measures prevented 6th Army from being plunged into the vortex of defeat which had engulfed its neighbours, they also inevitably led to its encirclement. What must be made perfectly clear, on the other hand, is that it was the Supreme Command's business to issue an order affording 6th Army the opportunity to acquire operational elbow room, and thereby to avoid being surrounded. A far-sighted leader would have realized from the start that to mass the whole of the German assault forces in and around Stalingrad without adequate flank protection placed them in mortal danger of being enveloped as soon as the enemy broke through the adjacent fronts. When the Soviets unleashed their big offensive across the Don and south of Stalingrad on 19th of November, the German leaders must have known what was coming. From that moment onwards, it was inadmissible to wait until the enemy had overrun the Romanians, for even if their armies had not been carved up so quickly, it would still have been necessary to use 6th Army in a mobile role in order to master the situation on the southern wing of Army Group B. By the evening of 19th November at the latest, therefore, OKH should have given 6th Army fresh orders allowing it freedom to manoeuvre. Without going into the details of the first few days of the Soviet offensive, one may safely say that the encirclement of 6th Army could only have been prevented if the latter had attempted a breakout in the very early stages, either by crossing the Don to the west or by striking southwest along the east side of the river. The onus of ordering it to do so lay with the Supreme Command. While General Paulus should certainly have taken his own decision to disengage from Stalingrad, He could hardly have done so as early as OKH, not being briefed, as the latter was, on the situation in the neighbouring army areas. By 22nd or 23rd November, when he did ask for permission to break out, the vital hour may already have been missed. The fact that it was a serious psychological error to put this request to Hitler at all is another matter. Paulus had been acquainted with Hitler's views on the war in the East since the winter of 1941, when he had been Oberquartiermeister the Föhn at OKH. He was aware that Hitler credited himself with having saved the German army from the disaster of a Napoleonic retreat that winter by ordering every foot of ground to be held. He must have realized that after Hitler's remarks about Stalingrad in his Sportpalast speech, the dictator would never agree to evacuation. The city's name was too closely bound up with his own military reputation. Thus, the only solution would have been to confront him with the fait accompli of the army's disengagement from Stalingrad. It is conceivable, of course, that such action might have cost Paulus his head. Yet no one must think that it was any fear of what might happen to him personally that kept Paulus from taking things into his own hands and doing what he believed to be right. It is more likely to have been loyalty to Hitler which impelled him to try to get the army's breakout authorized, particularly as he was in direct touch with OKH by radio. And, as I have already pointed out, he can hardly have had a sufficiently clear picture of the overall situation. The difficulty of deciding to act on his own initiative may also have been increased by the fact that a breakout would momentarily have meant a bigger risk to the army than forming a hedgehog position in Stalingrad. For the time being, HQ Don Army Group was unable to take a hand in events by issuing any orders of its own. It could not take over its full responsibilities until such time as I arrived in Novocherkassk, the place earmarked as our headquarters location, with a reasonably complete operations staff and the necessary channels of communication had been established. Neither would be the case for some days yet. For one thing, our aircraft had been grounded by a blizzard in the central sector, as a result of which we were having to continue the journey by train. Nonetheless, as the future commander of the army group, I had to make up my mind on one thing straight away on the basis of the situation report given to us on 24th November. Ought 6th Army, if possible, to effect a breakout even at this late stage, or would it not be better, now that the first chance of doing so had undoubtedly been missed, to wait until a relief force could drive out to meet it? After careful reflection, and in complete agreement with my Chief of Staff, General Schultz, and the Chief of Operations, Colonel Boos, I came to this conclusion. The enemy would in the first instance do everything in his power to destroy the encircled 6th Army. At the same time, we had to bear in mind the possibility that he would try to exploit the collapse of 3rd Romanian Army by pushing mechanized forces across the large bend of the Don towards Rostov, where he was offered the prospect of cutting off the rear communications not only of 6th and 4th Panzer armies, but also of Army Group A. The forces at the enemy's disposal, which he could doubtless augment by road and rail transport, would allow him to pursue the two aims simultaneously. I further concluded that the Army Group's foremost task must in any case be the liberation of 6th Army. On the one hand, the fate of 200,000 German soldiers was at stake. On the other, unless the army were kept in existence and ultimately set free, there could hardly be any hope of restoring the situation on the right wing of the Eastern Front. One thing was clear. Even if we were able to raise the siege and re-establish contact, 6th Army must on no account be left at Stalingrad. The city's prestige value, as far as we were concerned, was non-existent. On the contrary, if we should succeed in getting the army out, it would be urgently needed to give the maximum possible help in stabilizing the situation on the southern wing sufficiently to bring us safely through the winter. The immediate question, however, was whether 6th Army, having once missed its real opportunity to break out, should try to do so at this particular moment. As 2 days had passed since General Paulus's request to Hitler, the attempt could not, according to Army Group B, begin before 29th or 30th November. By then the enemy would already have had more than a week in which to tighten his hold on the pocket. The army would have the choice of only 2 escape routes, and in either case the enemy would be ready for it. One possibility was to break out towards the Don crossing at Kalach. But even if the army managed to pierce the encircling ring in this direction, there would still be the Don to bar its passage. Although most of the ammunition would have been expended on the original breakthrough, the army would now have to force a crossing against the powerful forces advancing west of the river towards the lower Cheer against negligible opposition. Its prospects of getting across when it was short of ammunition and hard pressed by the enemy from north, east and south seemed more than doubtful. Conditions might be slightly better if 6th Army were to try to break through to the remnants of 4th Panzer Army by moving in a southwesterly direction east of the Don, though here too the enemy would be ready for it. The objection in this case was that even if the actual breakthrough were successful, the army could not count on there being any German forces to meet it in the first instance. On its heels would be the Soviet armies now opposite its eastern, northern and western fronts around Stalingrad, while west of the river the enemy would be able to follow it southwards and forestall all its attempts to effect a crossing to the west. Most probably the army would sooner or later have no choice but to stand and fight out in the steppes without adequate supplies of ammunition, fuel or food. Some elements, such as tank units, might possibly get away, but the fate of the army as a whole would be sealed. The Soviet forces it had been engaging till then would be released, and this in turn was likely to lead to the destruction of the German army's entire southern wing, including Army Group A, which was still out in the Caucasus. For the sake of both 6th Army and the situation on the southern wing generally, our aim had to be to get the former out of the pocket intact and in fighting trim. This might have been done already if the Supreme Command had granted it operational freedom as soon as the danger of its encirclement became apparent. By now, however, it seemed too late for the army to break free and remain fit for further action without the extraneous help of relief forces. On the other hand, it could be assumed that once the two relief groups moved off, 6th Army's position would be substantially easier in the operational sense, even if not for the initial breakthrough. Once the enemy advancing west of the Don were engaged by other forces, 6th Army would at least be spared the prospect of having to fight that particular opponent. And if, at the same time as 6th Army moved off, the other relief group were to thrust into the rear of the Soviet siege front east of the Don, the enemy would be compelled to weaken the latter and thereby to facilitate the beleaguered army's initial breakthrough. Although the Holit relief group was finally never committed in that role, it did in fact tie down the Soviet forces operating west of the Don. The advance of 4th Panzer Army, on the other hand, forced the enemy to weaken his front around Stalingrad considerably. Author. At the same time, the fact had to be faced that any delay was dangerous, since it would give the enemy time to consolidate his siege front. Such a risk could only be entertained if the Supreme Command guaranteed to supply 6th Army by air for as long as was needed to liberate it. Such was the premise for not now resorting to the desperate solution of an isolated breakout by 6th Army, but for awaiting a fresh opportunity. This would present itself as soon as the relief groups could go in. In the light of the foregoing, I informed the Chief of Staff of the Army by telephone that the Army Group's views were as follows. A breakout by 6th Army to the southwest was probably still possible even now. To leave the army at Stalingrad any longer constituted an extreme risk, in view of the ammunition and fuel shortage. Nevertheless, since we considered that the best chance for an independent breakout had already been missed, it was preferable from the operational point of view at the present time to wait until the projected relief groups could come to the army's aid, always assuming that an adequate airlift could be counted upon. The latter factor, we emphasized, was absolutely decisive. The relief operation could be launched with the forces due to arrive at the beginning of December. To achieve real effect, however, it would require a steady flow of further reinforcements, as the enemy would also be throwing in powerful forces on his own side. An isolated breakout by 6th Army might still become necessary if strong enemy pressure were to prevent us from deploying these new forces. An absolute prerequisite for accepting the risk of not making an immediate breakout from Stalingrad was that 6th Army should daily receive 400 tons of supplies by air. 400 tons daily was the Army's minimum requirement of vehicle fuel and infantry and armour-piercing ammunition. After the ration stocks, etc., had been exhausted, this basic minimum rose to 550 tons. I made it perfectly clear in this conversation that unless the delivery of supplies could be guaranteed, one could not risk leaving Sixth Army in its present situation any longer, however temporarily. Anyone who witnessed the subsequent tragedy of Stalingrad, Hitler's mulish determination to hold on to the city, OKH's deliberate failure to take the very last chance offered to it, a subject on which more will be said in due course. The delays which occurred in assembling the relief group of 4th Panzer Army, and the Soviet breakthrough on the Italian front which rendered Army Detachment Hollit incapable of any action to relieve Stalingrad, will conclude that it would have been better to insist on an immediate breakout by 6th Army. It is fair to assume that at least some elements of the besieged formation would have managed to fight their way through to the remnants of 4th Panzer Army. Certainly the tank units and probably a number of the infantry battalions too. On the other hand, it is unlikely that the army would have remained capable of operating as a formation. Things had already taken too ominous a turn by the earliest date at which a breakout could have been attempted. Yet at the same time as the extricated elements of 6th Army might have been joining 4th Panzer Army, the entire enemy siege forces would have been released. With that, in all probability, the fate of the whole southern wing of the German forces in the east would have been sealed, including Army Group A. I would nonetheless emphasize that the latter consideration played absolutely no part in shaping our appreciation of 24th November. Far from wanting to sacrifice 6th Army in the interest of saving the southern wing, we hoped that it would have a better chance of escape when working in conjunction with the two groups earmarked for its relief than if it tried, at this late stage, to break out on its own. My staff and I were actuated by the hope of extricating not mere military debris, but a complete army which would still be fit for further operations. It goes without saying that the name of Stalingrad and the prestige factor cut no ice with us whatever. That day, therefore, we refrained from presenting Hitler with a final demand for the breakout of 6th Army, or from ordering it on our own responsibility. One might add here that General Paulus, faced with the dilemma of whether to obey Hitler or the headquarters of his army group, would hardly have been able to opt for the latter. For the rest, it was perfectly clear to us that even if the relief groups were able to get through to 6th Army, the latter could not possibly be left at Stalingrad any longer. The essential thing to ensure was that it retained as much of its fighting power as possible in the meantime. It was much more likely to achieve this in the Stalingrad area, provided that it were properly supplied from the air, than if it were caught out in the steppes while trying to escape. The criterion of whether 6th Army could be freed in this way was twofold, however. First, would the Luftwaffe be in a position to meet the army's vital needs? Secondly, could the Supreme Command furnish further relief forces? And if so, would it be prepared to do so? Both questions were clearly expressed in our message to OKH. Only Hitler, who as Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht had power over all forces of the army and Luftwaffe in every theatre of war, was able to judge what the prospects were and take the appropriate decision. If the decision were an affirmative one, we should be justified in shelving the desperate measure of an isolated breakout and in leaving the army at Stalingrad. Should Hitler, however, be unwilling to commit every available man to the relief of Stalingrad while there was still time, or should he indulge, against his better judgment, in illusions about the capacities of the Luftwaffe, he would be guilty of dire irresponsibility. The same may be said of those who, as it later turned out, awakened and fortified such beliefs in him, or who would not understand that the fate of 6th Army must have precedence over the demands of all other theatres. That Goering would commit the supreme frivolity of promising an adequate airlift, and then not even lay himself out to produce at least what he had available, was something no soldier could foresee. Neither, however, did we foresee to what extent Hitler would ignore all factual considerations in favour of his hold or bust theory. Who could suppose that he would accept the loss of a whole army for the sake of the name of Stalingrad? On the afternoon of 24th of November, we continued the journey from Starobielsk to Novocherkassk. 10 years before, I had travelled down the same line to Rostov to attend the manoeuvres of the Red Army in the Caucasus. On that earlier occasion, all sorts of interesting impressions had lain ahead of me. Today it was a mission as to the gravity of which my staff and I had no illusions. Time and again our thoughts went out to our beleaguered comrades at Stalingrad, despite the efforts of my ADC, Lieutenant Stahlberg, to divert us with good gramophone music and talk of other problems. He had joined our staff after the death of Peppo, having been brought to me by my former colleague Treskov, whose nephew he was. Stahlberg remained my constant companion till the end of the war. Throughout those years he was a faithful assistant to me in all personal matters. On the morning of 26th of November, I broke my journey in Rostov to see General Hofe, the head of the German military mission to Romania, who had originally been designated as the German Chief of Staff of Antonescu's army group. He painted a most disagreeable picture of the state of the two Romanian armies on the Stalingrad front. Of their 22 original divisions, he told us, 9 were completely wiped out, 9 had run away and could not be sent into action for the time being, and 4 were still fit for battle. Given time, however, he hoped to form a few extra formations out of the wreckage. The antithesis to Hofe's report was provided by a letter written to me by Marshal Antonescu. He had some bitter things to say about the Supreme Command, which he accused of not paying enough attention to his frequent warnings regarding the mounting danger in the Kremenskaya bridgehead opposite 3rd Romanian Army's front. He also complained of the way his own assumption of command had been repeatedly postponed. With every justification, moreover, the Marshal pointed out that of all Germany's allies, Romania and he personally had done most for the common cause. Of his own accord, he had made 22 divisions available for the 1942 campaign, and unlike Italy or Hungary, had unreservedly placed these under German command, despite not being bound to the Reich by any obligation of a contractual nature. His letter voiced the justified disillusionment of a soldier who sees his troops lost through the mistakes of others. Inwardly, I could not dispute the justness of the Marshal's criticisms. I wrote to tell him that as one who had not previously been involved in the events in question, I was unable to comment on his strictures myself and had passed his letter on to Hitler, at whom of course I knew them to be aimed. It could certainly do Hitler no harm to have to read such unvarnished criticism by his most loyal ally. Besides, the letter touched on a political question, that of confidence between allies. Antonescu mentioned that his mortal enemy, the leader of the Iron Guard, had been put beyond his reach by Himmler and was now being kept in Germany for a rainy day. The Iron Guard, a radical political organization, had earlier staged a putsch against the Antonescu regime and initially succeeded in surrounding the Marshal's official residence. Though the Marshal had ultimately been able to put down the rising, the Iron Guard leader had escaped abroad. It was understandable that Antonescu should consider himself disloyally treated when Himmler now held a protecting hand over this man. Such underhand tactics were hardly conducive to the strengthening of an alliance. Antonescu's original reason for writing to me was to complain that German officers and men, in both their official and unofficial capacities, had been guilty of roughly handling Romanian soldiers and passing defamatory remarks about them. Although such occurrences could be accounted for by recent events and the poor showing made by many Romanian units, I naturally took immediate action. However much one might sympathise with the indignation of German troops who had been left in the lurch by neighbouring units, incidents of this kind could only damage our common cause. I have already shown what could and could not be expected of Romanian troops in various situations, but they were still our best allies, and did fight bravely in many places. On 26th of November, we arrived at our new headquarters in Novocherkassk. The only guard unit available was a battalion of Cossack volunteers, who obviously considered it a special honour to do sentry duty in front of our office building. As our main channels of communication were ready the next night, we were able to take over command of Don Army Group on the morning of 27th November. The task confronting us was a two-sided one. Its chief feature, and the one on which everything depended, was the relief and rescue of 6th Army. Apart from being a priority in the humane sense, this was also vital from the operational point of view, first and foremost because there could be hardly any hope of restoring the situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, or indeed in the Eastern Theatre as a whole, unless the forces of 6th Army were preserved. The other side of the task, and this had to be borne in mind throughout, was the already existing danger that the entire southern wing of the German armies would be destroyed. If this were allowed to happen, it would most probably be the end of the struggle in the east, and consequently lose us the war. Should the Russians succeed in tearing through the flimsy screen, for the moment consisting mainly of Romanian remnants and German B-echelon troops and emergency units, which, leaving aside the so-called fortress of Stalingrad, constituted the sole protection of the whole operational area between the rear of Army Group A and the still existing Don Front, not only 6th Army's position would be hopeless. That of Army Group A, as well, would become more than critical. It was thanks to the commander of 4th Panzer Army, Colonel General Hoth, and the recently appointed Chief of Staff of 3rd Romanian Army, Colonel Wenck, that we ever succeeded at all, in the critical days at the end of November, in raising the screens which, by covering the enormous gaps between 6th Army, Army Group A and the Don Front, prevented any exploitation of the situation by the Russians. Had the enemy been able at that time to thrust a fast-moving army down to the lower Don at Rostov, which he was undoubtedly strong enough to do, the loss of Army Group A as well as 6th Army would have become quite conceivable. But even though this mortal threat to the southern wing remained constantly present, the Army Group did not allow one single man or round of ammunition needed for the rescue of 6th Army to be diverted from that task. As long as there was the remotest prospect of success, it went to the very limit of its powers and resources to bring off the attempted relief. To do so, it had to accept the greatest imaginable risks. The fact that we ultimately failed in our mission was primarily due to the extraordinary preponderance of the enemy's forces and the deficient strength of our own. Further handicaps were created by weather conditions, which greatly hampered the activities of the Luftwaffe, particularly in supplying 6th Army, and by the transport position, which did not permit the relief forces to be brought into action quickly enough. Furthermore, we now experienced for the first time the inhibitions which emanated from the German Supreme Command, and had their origin in Hitler's personality, opinions, and character. These have already been described in the chapter on Hitler's military leadership. Their effect in this case was that the Supreme Command would not run the risk of setbacks on other fronts in order to put everything it had into the relief operation. Furthermore, they caused repeated delays in the taking of priority decisions, although the trend of the situation could be clearly foreseen and had repeatedly been pointed out to Hitler by our own headquarters. Of the two different tasks I mentioned as confronting the Army Group on its assumption of command, the first, that of extricating 6th Army, was virtually all over by Christmas 1942, when it was clear that 4th Panzer Army could no longer succeed in effecting a link-up.